What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on the things you might want to know ahead of Baldur's Gate 3 about the story of the previous games as well as other events leading up to the newest title. As that game is releasing in now less than a month, one of the more common questions I've seen repeated is people being curious about if prior knowledge of the previous two games, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, is necessary to understand all of Baldur's Gate 3. So I thought we would cover that and more in this video today, but to answer that very simple question, the answer is no. You don't need to play Baldur's Gate 1 or 2 to understand Baldur's Gate 3. You can just jump straight to 3, you'll be fine, you don't need any prior knowledge. However, obviously it's a bit more nuanced than that. There are things that would be beneficial to you to know, many of which we're going to cover in this video, but strictly speaking, it's not necessary. However, if you would like to know the full story of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, I myself have made pretty long videos covering the story of those games in their entirety, as have other creators. But today I want to take the spark notes of what is important there alongside various other sources of information and compile that into many things that would be of interest to you ahead of Baldur's Gate 3. So with that said, let's actually dive fully into this and talk about it. So Baldur's Gate 3 is being set in 1492 DR, which is the year for the relevant world of Faerun and the Sword Coast here. Baldur's Gate 1 kicks off in 1368, meaning that it took place about 120 plus years before the events of 3. In spite of that very large gap in time, we do know that Baldur's Gate 3 will be tied to those earlier two games. Larian Studios, the developer, put out a Reddit AMA years ago, back in like 2020, talking about this and how the events of Baldur's Gate 3 will have been directly put into motion by the events of the previous games. We don't know the extent of that, obviously we'll have to play 3 to figure that out, but again, it won't be critical information. But that said, let's actually talk about the events of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 and how that brings us towards 3. So, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 tell the story of the Bhaal spawn, the child of the dead god Bhaal, who is the Lord of Murder. His divine sphere is in fact murder. Bhaal, long before the events of the first game, saw his death at the hands of another god, and in order to circumvent this, he laid the groundwork for a grand plan involving having numerous children who, thanks to their divine heritage, would inherit a piece of their father's divine essence. This was primarily carried out with priestesses of Bhaal. They were to sacrifice all of these infants in his name, thus reanimating him. However, that particular event was interrupted by a group called the Harpers, one of which took our main character in, and that's how we arrive at Candlekeep preceding the events of those two games. As the games themselves actually kick off, pretty much all of these children have become adults and are now trying to find their own way in the world. However, their divine blood pushing them towards rather violent acts as they are connected to the Lord of Murder. This ultimately kicks off what is known as the War of the Bhaal spawn, which is all of these children fighting for each other in a sort of last man standing style, where the winner gets to ascend to the mantle of godhood and become the Lord of Murder. Baldur's Gate 2 ends with you getting to make the choice of either taking on all that power and becoming the Lord of Murder, or letting it be carried off by angels to Mount Celestia, which will let you then live out the rest of your days as a mortal. That is where Baldur's Gate 2 ends. However, obviously we have more information to cover, because this is where it gets a little weird. You see, the idea of canon in a TTRPG like D&D isn't always the most straightforward of subjects, but in the event of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and where they took the lore later on, we actually have a canonical protagonist for those games. I sincerely doubt they'll involve this character directly much, just because it's probably best to keep it vague, but canonically, the Bhaal spawn that we played in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 was a human man known as Abdel Adrian. Following the events of 2, Abdel Adrian became a Grand Duke of Baldur's Gate and led the city for an incredibly long time before his death at the age of 135 in the year of 1482. That is to say, 10 years before the events of Baldur's Gate 3. So while the events of the first two games were a very long time ago, the canonical protagonist of those games only died relatively recently, only 10 years before the events of the new game. What's more, he didn't just die some random death. He died during the events of an adventure with D&D known as Murder in Baldur's Gate. This adventure actually kicks off with the death of Abdel Adrian at the hands of the other last Bhaal spawn known as Vikang. I always get his name messed up. They fought and ultimately both died, one of which turned into an avatar of Bhaal before ultimately being killed. They're actually not sure which one of them won the fight, but ultimately it's whatever. The thing is, though, this has a lot of other implications. You see, by the last of his children finally dying, the dead god Bhaal was finally able to resurrect himself. Meaning that in the year of Baldur's Gate 3, the previously dead god of murder has once again risen up. However, it gets more complicated yet, because thanks to all of the events that had happened since then, Bhaal at this point is not technically a god. Following an event known as the Second Sundering, which took place from 1482 to 1487, give or take, Bhaal, as well as two other deities known as Bane and Merkel, who collectively make up the Dead Three, became what are known as quasi-divine beings. That is to say, they were at one time incredibly powerful deities, but have at this point lost most of their power. However, they are still very strong mortals. This is important for a couple of reasons. For starters, that means these three are very much so capable of walking around at the time of Baldur's Gate 3. And two, we actually hear several mentions of the Dead Three and their cults in and around Baldur's Gate in the early access areas of Baldur's Gate 3. So if you're looking for a direct connection to the previous two games, that's probably about as good as you're going to get. However, we still are not done, because there are two more things I want to talk about, specifically a man named Ulder Ravengard and how he knew Abdel Adrian, alongside a D&D module known as Descent into Avernus, which is more of a direct prequel to Baldur's Gate 3 in terms of timeline. But first, Ulder Ravengard. Ulder Ravengard for many years served as Abdel Adrian's right-hand man. Both Abdel and Ulder served in the Flaming Fist, a mercenary company that sort of acts as law and order in the city of Baldur's Gate. You'll have seen them in many of the promotional materials at some point or another. However, after Abdel's death, Ulder took his place essentially. He became the Grand Duke of Baldur's Gate right after this. And what's more, Ulder Ravengard is in Baldur's Gate 3. There is a quest in Early Access where we can hear direct mention of him, and while we don't get to interact with him in this area, it's safe to assume he'll be a significant part of it just by what is available in Early Access. Ulder Ravengard also comes up as part of Descent into Avernus, but before we get into that, another thing to keep in mind is that two of the recently announced companions for Baldur's Gate 3 are Jaheira and Minsk, both of which were party members in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. And while I won't get into them a ton, these are just more people who knew the protagonist from the first two games, so while certainly not critical information per se, something you'll notice if you have this information. Now, for Jaheira, she also just lived from that time period to now. She is a half-elf, and they are by their nature long-lived, though she is getting up there in years as of the time of Baldur's Gate 3. Minsk is a human. He, however, got turned into a statue, which is how he survived all this time. So there are just three examples of people we will be meeting who have a very direct connection to the previous two games in some way. But let's talk about Descent into Avernus. This was a D&D module that was published around the time Baldur's Gate 3 was first initially announced. Now, unlike everything we've talked about up to this point, Descent into Avernus does a good job of setting the stage for the area surrounding Baldur's Gate right before the game kicks off. Descent into Avernus covers the story of a nearby town of Elturel, more specifically a city, but it was ultimately dragged into the first layer of the Nine Hells known as Avernus by Zariel, due to some backhanded dealings almost 50 years ago from 1492. As part of that D&D module, we see a group of adventurers descending into Avernus, and through one of many possible means, ultimately manage to return the city up to its actual place back on Faerun. But there's a bit more to it still, because Ulder Ravengard, the Grand Duke of Baldur's Gate, was in Elturel when this happened. He was there on a diplomatic mission. We know he survives this and was on his way back to Baldur's Gate when the events of Baldur's Gate 3 kick off. What's more, following the events of Elturel, we get a direct connection to what is going on in the opening act of Baldur's Gate 3. This is why we see that refugee camp of tieflings in the Druid's Grove. They're refugees from Elturel, because after being returned from the first layer of hell, they decided that the people walking around looking like literal devils didn't need to be in the city anymore, so they effectively kicked all of the tieflings out, which is why we see this group of refugees making their way to Baldur's Gate, which is the next nearest major city. There are also some other minor connections to Avernus we can make just from the early access period alone, such as the newly announced origin character Karlach, who is a tiefling who fought in the Blood War, which itself is a cosmic war between law and chaos, happening on the first layer of the Nine Hells, Avernus. Now, beyond all of those connections in there, we also have everything that's actually going on in Baldur's Gate 3 with the mind flayers, their parasitic tadpoles that should be turning us into mind flayers, forming a critical piece of the plot, and wherever it goes from there, which could be a variety of factors that ultimately we will have to actually wait to play through Baldur's Gate 3 to figure out how it factors in. But in terms of all of the necessary information that somebody might want heading into Baldur's Gate 3 in terms of context for the story, I would say that is the most critical bits. Beyond this, just reading up on general Forgotten Realms lore, if you will, and surrounding topics such as the city of Baldur's Gate itself, alongside the Dead 3, Bhaal, the Second Sundering even, all could be pretty useful information to potentially have. But again, truth be told, none of this is necessary, I would say. None of this is really truly critical information to know, but it will certainly help inform your playthrough to hopefully give you a little more added context. That said, that is pretty much going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you have any other questions, by all means, drop them down in the comment section below, and myself or someone else, I'm sure, will answer them for you. Though, either way, we don't have much longer to wait before we have our answers now at this point anyway. Though, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.